There's very little that is more annoying than playing a mana rock on turn 2 and then you pass it on to the next player and they just go, well, I'm gonna play a Lauren of the third path and blow up that thing because I'm just trying to play on curve. Every time that happens, I just fall into a pit of deep despair. I mean, it gets worse than that, right? How often have you heard, well, I'm playing a farewell, I might as well choose all modes. Or the green player's like, I gotta deal with that enchantress player over there, so I'm gonna go ahead and drop my Bane of Progress now. The blue player goes, hey, Cyclonic Rift, everything, and all of your shit is back in your hand. A nightmare, I tell you. I don't like mana rocks anymore. They drive me mad because they just coincidentally die. That ends today. I went and researched all of the cards that flip into lands so that I can ramp with lands even when I'm not playing green. And today, I'm gonna present to you my findings. For you green players, here are the ones that exist. You don't need to worry about them. Just cultivate. I guess Growing Rights of Itlamok and Journey to Eternity are pretty good. But if you're green, you don't need these. You can just play your cultivates. Now, admittedly, everybody has some land ramp with Solemn and Scampering Surveyor. And if you're white, you can use catch-up ramp. But that's not what today is about. Today is about this kind of nonsense. So let's get started. Our first category here are cards that are just a little bit too slow, too expensive to be ramp. Like for example, O'Hare Tuck. Deepest Foundation is a 6-mana creature that when it dies, it flips into a land. I mean, to be honest, it's a pretty good card, but it's just too expensive to be considered ramp. Aklasot's Deepest Betrayal has the same problem at 5 mana. And then we've got cards like Grasping Shadows, which is actually kind of cool, but it takes 4 mana and 3 turns to be turned into a land, and that's just too much. But there are 3 cards that I think that are worth giving shoutouts to in this category, which are Formatic Compass, which is just a really good card. I think you should be playing this, and it does flip into a good land, but it's just a little bit too slow to be considered ramp because it flips once you have 7 lands in play, and at that point, are you even really ramping anymore? We got Azor's Gateway. The backside of this is hilarious. It lets you tap for X color of any mana, where X is your life total. Tap that thing for 40 mana, win the game. That's brilliant. But at the same time, Azor's Gateway, the front side, takes 5 turns to flip and 5 mana. And while you're doing it, it's just on the board. I've never managed to flip this thing. It always gets killed immediately. So I don't know. I think it's neat, but you're never gonna actually get there. And then we got Tarian's Journal, which is actually a nice card. It's a 2-mana artifact. You can tap to sacrifice something to draw a card. That's a good effect. And then you can flip it for 2 mana if you just discard your entire hand, which is questionable. That is definitely not the best effect. But the backside lets you cast creature spells out of your graveyard, which is actually really cool. I feel like Tarian's Journal has a home in some deck. I just haven't figured out which it is yet. Now we're getting to cards that I think are reasonable. These are okay. We've got O'Hare Axonil and O'Hare Pakpatik. Both of these are what I like to call scary solemns. These are solemn simulacrums that will just make everybody terrified of you. Now that can be good. Sometimes these bait out a removal spell. You play O'Hare because you're trying to ramp, they beast within it. Amazing. You got your ramp done and you got a removal spell out of their hand. But other times, you play these and your opponents think, oh, they're gonna try to kill us. Well, I guess we'll kill him. And in that scenario, it's not so good. And these aren't great. So play these with caution. I do think that they have a purpose though. O'Hare Axonil is probably a little bit too scary, but O'Hare Pakpatik, I think is great. I really like this card, and I think I'm gonna try to play it a bit more than I currently do. Then we've got Brass's Tunnel Grinder, which requires you to descend 3 times to flip it, but it needs to be done across 3 turns. And the backside is a land that taps for red, and when you use that to cast a permanent spell, you get to discover for X, where X is that spell's mana value. That is fantastic. At the very least, that's a card draw. This is a great card if you manage to flip it. But personally, I find it actually somewhat difficult to descend 3 times. The tricky part with the Brass's Tunnel Grinder as well is that there isn't really a way to speed it up. You just need to do it across 3 different turns, which gives your opponents a lot of time to respond to it. So while I like this card, I think it is a bit specific and a bit difficult to make use of. Then we get to one of my favorite cards, even though it's not great, but I really like it, which is Golden Guardian. This is a 4-mana 4/4 Defende, that has a 2-mana ability that allows it to fight one of our own creatures, not one of our opponents. This is not a removal. This needs to be done on our own stuff. And then if it dies this turn, it returns back into play as a land. And that land can tap for 2 mana of any color, or for 4 mana, it can be tapped to create another 4/4 golem. And sure, it costs 2 mana to activate, but it immediately turns into a land that taps for 2 mana, refunding that cost. So Golden Guardian is a card that I found to be fantastic in decks that can have creatures that are big enough to fight into it. The problem is that having a creature that's at least a 4/5 is kind of difficult. There's just not that many creatures that are that big. Even O'Hare Axonil from earlier is only a 4/4, and that's a pretty big guy. So you need to make sure that you're playing a deck where you can reliably have creatures in play that are big enough that the Golden Guardian can fight into them and die. But if you can secure that, I actually think this card is fantastic. Really, really nice. Conqueror's Galleon, on the other hand, is easier to flip. It's a 4-mana vehicle that requires us to crew it for 4 and attack once, and then it turns into a land. But the land isn't quite as good. The land right here only taps for 1 colorless mana, but it does have some additional utility where it can potentially let us draw a card or even get us a card back out of our graveyard. So I don't think Conqueror's Galleon is terrible or anything like that, but man, I really like Golden Guardian. I found this card to be very, very fun to play with. You can use it in response to it dying. You just need to activate its ability and then fight something. It doesn't then matter what it dies to. Next up are the cards that are great in the right deck. They need the right deck though. So for example, Vance's Blasting Cannons and Primal Amulet are both cards that need to be in Spellslinger decks. Because of their conditions to flip, they require you to play a bunch of spells. But if you do flip them, they are amazing. Spitfire Bastion is a land that just has a 3-mana lightning bolt attached to it. You can just tap it to shoot things for free damage. Isn't that incredible? Repeatable removal on a land. Absurd. And Primal Wellspring lets you duplicate your instants and sorceries for free. Damn, that is insane. Although admittedly, Primal Amulet draws a lot of hostility. This is the kind of card that will get you attacked. So that makes it a little bit worse in my opinion. While Vance's Blasting Cannons, the front side of the Spitfire Bastion, nobody cares about that. It's just a little bit of card advantage. Then we've got Storm the Void, which is a 4-mana enchantment that flips if we control 5 or more artifacts in our end step. Importantly though, this also just has a really nice baseline effect, where whenever 1 or more of our creatures deals combat damage to a player, we get a treasure token. And of course, if we deal damage to 3 players, we get 3 treasure tokens. So we can just use this as an engine in the early game and then flip it whenever we want to. Once it's flipped, it's also incredible, where it taps for either 1 mana of any one color or for an amount of blue equal to the amount of artifacts we control. Now this does of course require us to play some sort of artifact theme, which is tricky because the front side sort of cares about us having a lot of creatures. So maybe you want like an artifact creature deck, something along those lines. You definitely need to build around Storm the Void, which is why it's kind of here, right? Like it's great in the right deck. Both sides of the card are fantastic, but something that annoys me just a tiny little bit is it feels like they belong on different cards. It feels like these 2 sides of the cards don't synergize super well. Of course, you might say, well, you can use the treasures to flip it, and then the treasures count towards the mana generated. Yeah, but then I just have treasures sitting around not doing anything. I mean, of course, there could be worse things, but it still feels ever so slightly clunky to me. There are actually a surprising number of these that are great for creature decks specifically. Legion's Landing, for example, is a 1-mana enchantment that enters with a vampire, and then it flips once you attack with 3 or more creatures. That is so easy to do if you're in any sort of creature-based deck, especially in white. Similarly, Thousand Moons Smithy is an artifact that when it enters creates a gnome, and this gnome is as big as we have artifacts and creatures combined, which is actually massive. That's incredible. That is so good in the right deck. Now to flip this, we need to tap 5 artifacts or creatures at the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, which does sort of require us to skip a turn of attacking, which is a fairly heavy cost. However, the backside, Barracks of the Thousand, is incredible. It taps for a white mana, and if we use that white mana to cast an artifact or creature spell, we create a gnome. One of those gnomes from earlier that is as big as the number of things we have, which is pretty easily a lot, especially since this is always adding an additional creature to our board every turn. So I really like this card. I think it works incredibly well alongside Legion's Landing, which is also a card that I've been incredibly impressed by. Something that's more specific is Path of Metal. Path of Metal is an enchantment that when it comes into play, it deals 1 damage to anything that doesn't have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, or Haste. Which is actually pretty relevant, because that hits mana dorks. So if your opponents are playing a bunch of Llanowar elves, you can play Path of Metal and just clear that out. And then, when you attack with at least 2 creatures that have First Strike, Double Strike, Vigilance, and or Haste, you can transform Path of Metal, which then turns into a land that taps for 1 mana of any color. For 2 mana, it deals 2 damage to each opponent, which is not that big of a deal. But for 3 mana, you choose a creature at random that attacked this turn and destroy that creature. That last effect is incredible. Very importantly, this does not target. It chooses a creature at random, which means if your opponents are playing decks that are centered around individually big creatures, that maybe even have protection, maybe they put some Swiftfoot boots on there, maybe they're playing some sort of Voltron deck that wants to make its creatures shrouded, then this land can bypass so much of it. It's a land, which means it's colorless. It doesn't target, so it bypasses Hexproof and Shroud. And it's just a land that sits on the board. It applies pressure without you needing to do anything. This is a really, really powerful card, but the problem with it is that it requires you to be in a deck that can easily hit those keywords, which means you really need to be careful where you're playing it. This is not something that you can put into every deck. It really needs to be very specifically placed in something that can make use of it. Now we get to my favorite of the Great and the Right deck cards, which is Matzalantli, the Great Door. Matzalantli, the Great Door, is a 3 mana artifact that taps to draw a card and then discard a card. And then for 4 mana, you can tap it to transform it if there are 4 or more permanent types among permanent cards in your graveyard. So this transformation is a little bit tricky to achieve. You do need to put effort into it, but it helps you get there. It helps you fill up your graveyard, it helps you filter through cards. So this is a flip land that you don't necessarily want to flip right away, because it just, in the early game, helps you solidify your other game plans. But the backside is incredible. The Core is a land that taps for X mana of any one color, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. Maybe I'm being too generous here, and maybe I shouldn't be counting this as ramp. And if that's what you're saying, I will concede that point. But I was playing this in a Kiora the Rising Tide list, and it was unbelievable. Genuinely the strongest card in the deck. And it really wasn't that hard to flip. You just need to find a moment at some point. And from that point onward, you're adding 15, 20 mana to your mana pool every single turn. Now, you shouldn't rely on Matzalantli by itself entirely, because then it takes too long to get there. You definitely want to play this in a deck that can fill up its graveyard. But as long as you have that kind of shell surrounding it, I cannot recommend this card enough. It is actually absurd. Alright, now we're headed into the space of just fantastic cards that I found to be always good. We've got ourselves Dowsing Device. This is a 2-mana artifact that flips when you have 4 artifacts in play. Now, admittedly, that is maybe a slightly difficult condition, but it counts itself, so you really only need 3 additional artifacts. And importantly, this right here is in red. Since it's in red, you probably have some treasures lying around, and that's all that's needed to flip this thing. The nice thing too is that the front side is actually pretty handy. Whenever an artifact comes into play, you get to give one of your creatures haste, which is good. That's a good effect. That's helpful. The backside then is just a land that taps for red, but you can also tap it for 3 mana to give a creature haste and +X/+O, where X is the number of artifacts you control, which is fine. But the main selling point of Dowsing Device is that it's just so cheap. For 2 mana, you throw it down, you let it do its thing for a little while, and it will just passively flip at some point, and then you got an extra land. Dowsing Dagger, on the other hand, requires a little bit more work. It's a 2-mana equipment that you can equip for 2 mana that gives a creature +2/+1, and when it enters, you choose an opponent to create 2/0/2 plants with Defender. When the creature that Dowsing Dagger is equipped to deals combat damage to a player, you get to flip the Dowsing Dagger. And the backside of Dowsing Dagger is Lost Veil, a land that just taps for free mana of any color. Dowsing Dagger is incredibly good in Commander because, of course, you just give somebody the plants and then attack somebody else. It also works great with a lot of the early game utility creatures you should already be playing. If you have a mana dork, just equip it to a mana dork. If you have a helpful hunter, make it even more helpful by letting it flip your Dowsing Dagger. This card can sometimes feel slightly clunky if you get it in an awkward spot where you can't really break through your opponents. But if you get it, when you flip it, it is legitimately a game-winning effect to get that much of a lead. It is so freaking powerful when you get it that it makes up for any of the difficulties to flipping it. And to be completely honest, flipping it is not that hard. It really isn't. Just an incredibly good card, and because it's an artifact, you can play it in any deck. And then we've got Treasure Map. It's just a 2-mana artifact that you can tap for 1 mana to scry once and put a counter on it. And then once you have 3 counters on it, it flips, it turns into Treasure Cove, a land that taps for 1 colorless mana and that you can tap to sacrifice a treasure to draw a card. Very importantly though, when Treasure Map flips, it also creates free treasures. First of all, scrying is just a helpful effect. Scrying is generally very good to have. 1 mana to scry is maybe a little bit expensive, but keep in mind, we're having that mana refunded as soon as the Treasure Map flips. Secondly, Treasure Map is only 2 mana, so you can actually use this card very efficiently during the early game to just streamline your curve. And then once it flips, ooh, you can have such a good turn because you get free treasures, which you can immediately use. Of course, you can sacrifice them into the Treasure Cove to draw cards, but you don't have to do that. That doesn't have to be the strategy. You can just use the mana for mana and go for big plays with that. And then you've got your Treasure Cove just as an additional land that makes colorless, and that's okay too. This card is incredibly easy to make use of, and I think that makes just a massive, massive difference with these kinds of effects. And finally, my top 2 cards in this category are a bit of a pair, so I don't know if that counts. Maybe I'm cheating a little bit here. But they are Search for Azcanta and the Ever-Flowing Well. These 2 cards work together in an incredible way that makes for just a fantastic foundation for any deck that needs some additional mana. Search for Azcanta is a 2-mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1. Then, if you have Threshold, flip it. Okay, it doesn't actually say that, but it basically says that. Anyways, Search for Azcanta lets us filter through cards. And while it's filtering through cards, it's filling up our graveyard. And then once our graveyard is full, it turns into a land. The backside adds 1 blue mana, but for 3 mana we can tap it to look at the top 4 cards of our deck and search out any non-creature, non-land card amongst them and put it into our hand. Search for Azcanta is incredible because it's a 2-mana enchantment that will just passively generate value and then randomly flip at some point. Importantly, you can also choose to not flip this. So sometimes you prefer the surveilling, and so you keep it around until you want the mana. Then we've got the Ever-Flowing Well, which is a 3-mana artifact that when it enters, mills us 2 cards and then we draw 2 cards. It also flips at the beginning of our upkeep if we have 8 or more permanents in our graveyard. The backside then is the Myriad Pools, which taps for a blue mana, and when we use that blue mana to cast a permanent spell, we can choose one of our current existing permanents on the board to make it a copy of that permanent spell. Yes, permanents. We can do all kinds of wild stuff by just transforming our board into our powerful game-ending pieces. So the Myriad Pools is just a very powerful land, but what I really like about the Ever-Flowing Well is that it's just a good card by itself. It's just a 3-mana mill 2, draw 2 cards. That's a fine rate. I mean, it's not amazing, but it's okay. Now, we do need to fill up our graveyard for this, and that's where the Search for Azcanta comes in. You can see how these cards work well together. They both have the same goal and they both assist on the same path. And then once we have flipped them, they give us the mana that we need. I think these make for an amazing combination for blue decks. Now, you do need to make sure that you have enough permanents in your deck for the Ever-Flowing Well, so maybe a Spellslinger blue deck doesn't want it. But I found it to be just absolutely fantastic and an incredibly delightful card to play with. And I also like that Azcanta, the Sunken Ruin, lets me just dig out some additional cards when I need them. Now, admittedly, these cards aren't perfect. Like the Myriad Pulse is still an artifact, so it's gonna get hit by random artifact removal. And of course, these cards are just kind of collectively a lot slower than just, you know, playing a mana rock. But personally, I found that these kinds of effects, that these kinds of flip lands, are not only great additions to most decks, but also they're just a lot of fun to play with because they have a lot of cool and varied effects that make for great gameplay. So, I hope this has been helpful in some capacity. I hope this is something that you have enjoyed. Anyways, let me know what your favorite way of ramping is that doesn't involve mana rocks, and I'll see you guys next time.